Welcome, everyone. I'm Chari Elam, and I am so honored to have I'm going to call her an old friend, but maybe that might be an old, I watched her when she was young person, Liz Walsh. We were talking a moment ago about when we met, and I think it was 2013, 2014, when you had entered the grad student under Dr. Uliana Rangel. And with that, I want to hand it to you. Hi, Liz.
Thank you so much for having me, Chari. It's absolutely my pleasure. I'm so honored and excited to be here.
Great, great. Well, we're honored to have you. So what have you been up to? Those that don't know you, so let's just get familiar with Liz Walsh. Who are you?
A question I have to ask myself all the time.
Right.
Yeah, so as you said, I got a graduate degree under Juliana Rangel at Texas A&M University. There in the entomology department, I did my dissertation on honeybee queen health, especially in light of pesticides and the sublethal effects of those pesticides on queen health. I graduated with my PhD in 2019 and then went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship with Steve Pernall, who's out of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which I describe as the sort of the Canadian equivalent of the USDA. And there in northern Alberta, north of the Rocky Mountains, we kept bees in canola country, and we typically had about 400 colonies, which is humongous for a research laboratory. And there in canola country, because it's some of the most productive colony areas in the world, we got to do some really neat work looking at how different honeybee stocks respond to different health challenges, and being part of a national Canadian effort to match specific biomarkers with specific honeybee health challenges, with the end goal of having the National Bee Diagnostic Center of Canada have this tool so that beekeepers could send bees in, and the NBDC, the National Bee Diagnostic Center, could assess those bees for these biomarkers and tell the beekeeper, you know, we're seeing patterns that we associate with a pesticide exposure or with chalk brood or with American foul brood. And so after that, I just got hired on in May here at the United States Department of Agriculture's research laboratory in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I work for the honeybee breeding, genetics, and physiology research unit here. I'm the newest research entomologist. So
That's a mouthful.
It really is. I'm so excited about it, though.
And we are so excited for you. It has truly been, it's one of those things when you watch a student grow, and it's truly been awesome to watch you grow into where you've gotten. And we couldn't be more proud of you, Liz. And there's a lot of those TBA, Texas Beekeeper Association, and Texas Bee Supply people that have known you and are very, very pleased that you're here back on US soil. So what a wonderful dissertation there. That was awesome. So let's talk about bees.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, that's kind of your world. Your world. We've had, this has been an interesting year in the US. We've probably experienced the biggest drought situation that has happened in recent years anyway. In your exposure, has this drought that we are kind of embarking on getting past us? Yes, right. Have you seen in where you are in the beekeeping world, has there been an effect on queens or anything that you have been had your hand in the drought situation? Has it done anything?
This is one of those things where small differences make a big difference, because here in Louisiana, we're not under drought status, but there in College Station, last I checked, you guys were, or in College Station, Texas, at least,
Yeah,
not at your particular Texan location.
sure, but it's
But
area.
they were 8 inches light on rain. And so personally this year, I haven't seen drought effects here in Louisiana, but I remember seeing those sorts of things in Texas when I was there.
So do the bees react? Do you think that they react kind of like we do, like in a panic mode and make up for the loss, or do they succumb to it? What is the effect of that on a honeybee?
Yeah, well, there's some really, really neat honeybee stressor work that shows that there are additive effects of stressors. And some of this work is done by the Bee Informed Partnership Group and the associated researchers, but it's been done throughout the country at different USDA facilities as well, where when we see one stressor, so for instance, varroa mites, which are completely endemic, they're everywhere now. All colonies have them, and if you don't see evidence, you should look harder.
Yeah.
When you're pairing that sort of a stress with a nutritional stress, such as those caused by drought situations, we see additive effects. So it's not just the sum of stress A effects and the sum of stress B effects, it's extra on top of that. Does that make sense? I hope I phrased that in a way.
I think that we can, even relate that to humans, because if we've got one problem and then another one gets added on top of it, it just accentuates it. So that's exactly what I would expected you to say. Truly. Well, I think that we're coming out of drought. So we really are, believe it or not, the year is going, we're into fall. We're talking about October today, so we are in fall, whether the weather feels like it or not. What is it? So varroa, you brought that up. We're everything about varroa. I'm sure the readers are like, please stop. But we won't ever, will we, Liz? No.
And there's good reason, if I may cut in.
Please cut in.
There's that really, and I'm specifically thinking about Nathalie Steinhauer's really fantastic work, but everywhere, it's very rare that all scientists 100% agree on one topic, but the vast majority of us clearly state in all of the papers on US honeybee health and North American honeybee health that varroa is, as Nathalie so eloquently described it, the single strongest driver of colony mortality. And so that's why we talk about it. It's worth being talked about, because as much as we as beekeepers get so excited and so distracted thinking about other things, varroa is the single strongest driver of colony mortality in the US.
Have the thresholds changed at all? I know that Honeybee Health Coalition adjusted their numbers just a slightly bit several years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, of what they kind of went down. There were even times a year that 4% was acceptable, but I don't see anything with that anymore. 2%, 3% tops. Is that still the parameter that we're working with in your opinion?
The Canadians are going with 1% phoretic mite load. So I think it really depends on your geographic area, but also in your sampling method, because sampling methods are so incredibly different. You're gonna have to use an economic threshold that's appropriate for your sampling method, because if you're picking through drone pupa, you're going to have a different economic threshold than if you're doing an ethanol shake and seeing phoretic mites on workers there.
That's a good answer. You know, we don't think about that. We teach the beginning beekeeping class regularly, and I can say that I end it typically because a brand new beekeeper, as much as we want them to do alcohol wash, it's going to be a mic drop on a sticky board. Odds are, at least the first time.
Or a sugar shake.
Or a sugar shake. Something that they're not getting they're not getting an accurate reading.
Yeah. And actually,
go ahead.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I want you to interject. Please do.
You sparked a memory in me. So there was a fantastic talk put on by the Bee Informed Partnership that was showing that the accuracy of different varroa monitoring methods. And the one that really sticks out to me is that with a sugar shake, depending on who's doing it, you're getting between 70 and 80% of the varroa that are in there. But if you're doing an alcohol shake or an alcohol wash, whatever you want to call it, you're getting a much higher recovery rate of those varroa. And I'm not going to put a percentage on that because I'm going to put the wrong one on.
That's
but
okay.
I just remember being shocked that a sugar roll was only 70-some% accurate in there, because we think of, like, I was teaching at the time, so I'm like, a C. I'm getting a C always at the very best if I do that.
Wow, that's a real one. That drives it home, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was very memorable. Yeah, so the Bee Informed Partnership did that, and so it's so almost traumatic for me when I was a new beekeeper. Didn't think of killing 300 bees to do a mite assessment. But when you think that a healthy colony in the summer has between 60 to 80,000 individuals, 300 is a drop in the bucket, and it's for the good of the entire colony. So are you going to take those 300 now, or are you going to have a dead colony later because you were operating on information that wasn't valid?
That's a very good point. Very good point. All good stuff. And I'm going to now forever think of a C when I talk about that. May even use that in our next beginner class or even advanced class. It's very good and drives it home. So let's move past varroa. Let's talk about bees going into winter. So health is a big issue for our bees. We know we need to have healthy hives. Talk to us about a healthy hive, the importance of that, how we might obtain that, and just kind of what you would talk to somebody, a beekeeper, about going into October.
Yeah. I would give them the spiel about varroa, which we gave.
Of course.
And I think after that, I would say there are some things you can control and some things that you can't. You can compensate in some ways. So for instance, the drought, you can't control the weather, but it means that your bees have been getting subpar nutrition this season, which is pretty rough. You can compensate to some extent. And I would urge people to keep the biology of the honeybee in mind when they do that. So research, mine as well as others, shows that the bees don't do what we think they will. Like if you look at several of my research papers, you'll go, oh, she disproved her own hypothesis. Yes, because the bees don't do what we think they will sometimes.
Right.
And so it's important to keep it in mind from their perspective, if that makes sense. So you can feed, and from the beekeeper's perspective, it's like, they need it so badly. I should feed a lot. I should feed a lot consistently. But think about it from the bee's perspective. If you do that successfully, then they think there's this massive food availability there that is just not. And so what might they do in that situation? Well, we know from work that Mark Winston has shared with us, as well as others in honeybee biology, and all sorts of places, that bees, especially the Italians that we so commonly use, will rear as many young as they can, especially given the resources they have. So if you've created a massive artificial flow, then they might start extra brood rearing, and that's not what you want going into winter. So I would use that as an example to urge beekeepers to keep the bee mindset in their heads rather than the beekeeper mindset.
That is so great. That is so great, Liz. That is, well, we do hear that, not to stop you because I want you to continue to go, but I want to, like you did, I pulled something out of that. We do talk about, especially end of summer, trickle feeding. It is, what we're trying to do is sustain the bees. We're not just trying to load them and just feed them all they can eat. Fat bees, skinny bees. I think that the word implies feed till they won't eat anymore. But you know, like a goldfish in a bowl, to use as an example, it'll eat all it can eat, all that you provide it, until bad things happen. So we want to feed for health, but not feed to just blow up a colony and have spring conditions going into winter. We just need to think health, and what we're not trying to take over for them. We just want to help them.
Well, and the other thing, so I think trickle feeding is a really good tool in the toolkit for that. And also thinking of what you're feeding as well as when. So bees use pollen for brood rearing. Do they need that in the fall? No, because you do not want to encourage brood rearing in the fall. Could someone come up with a caveat to that? I'm sure there's always an exception somewhere.
Sure.
But in general, I don't want my bees to be encouraged to rear brood in the fall. And that goes for my research colonies as well as my personal colonies.
I think that where a lot of that falls, you know, we're encouraging beekeepers that have an ill-performing or a stagnant colony. Of course, you know, if we're in September, for all intensive purposes, leading into October, we just want to have enough nutrition, and the pollen patty might be more the not dry pollen going in and pretending and feeding 1-to-1 syrup, pretending that it's spring. We're breeding winter bees here, folks. We're breeding winter bees here. So I do, that takeaway of what you're saying is that we're not trying to breed a bunch of spring bees here. Right.
Yeah. Well, and there's some really, really good work on honeybee nutrition out of the USDA lab in Arizona too. If people are interested in reading more, they have done some really neat work on honeybee nutrition and about those fat and skinny bees. So that might be fun extra reading if people are interested. Yeah, the exciting and frustrating thing, I think, sometimes when I'm talking with new beekeepers, is that there's so many different answers that they get, and the fun part of that for me is that, and they might all be right, you know, so many different right ways to do it. It just all depends on your context and what you're pairing those ideas with. So it means that there's an infinite amount of creativity that you can bring to your own apiary and your own operation, which is exciting.
And you know, one thing that Blake should suggest always, and we've adopted the theory as well, is do your own study. You know, that's not beyond any of us. And area specific, you know, what's happening in Southeast Texas is not at all what's happening in Alberta.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and I think,
Completely different.
yeah. Well, and I think that's something that as a research community, we're kind of discovering as well, that we call them microclimates. The microclimate variability is just humongous. Even here in Baton Rouge, I have colonies that I'm looking at outside my window, and they're very different than the colonies down the road. So they forage on different things. There are different things available. There are different water resources available, and those water resources have different mineral content. You know, it's
So
wild.
True. So
So
true. Well, I want to touch on something that is in your title, really, is the pesticide end of the effects of pesticides on our honeybees. And that's a deep subject, and one we will not have time to go into the depth of your knowledge. But give us a feel for what just a normal backyard beekeeper, you know, the herbicides and the fungicides and so forth, what that's doing to our bees and how we can have a part of protecting them from that.
yeah, so my dissertation was on the sublethal effects of pesticides. I was really lucky to enter the field of honeybee toxicology at a time when we were just sort of figuring out that, one, we absolutely had to use field relevant rates of exposure to accurately assess what's going on. And two, what's going on isn't always just mortality. Sometimes it's sublethal, sometimes it's things that affect the health of the individual, but may not be immediately apparent the way mortality is, right? You can see a dead bee and go, oh, she's dead. But there's some more nuance we can go into. And so I was really lucky and excited to be able to do that in Dr. Rangel's lab for my dissertation. And I am lucky and excited to be doing a small amount of pesticide research here. And one of these are constantly amazing to me, and honeybees in particular are really interesting and exciting for me to look at, in part because there's so much variability, not just between the microclimates, but between different bee stocks as well. And so here in Baton Rouge, we're the bee stock unit because we're the breeding unit. And so we're able to look at how different stocks of honeybees handle things so differently. And that includes pesticides as well as varroa and other things we traditionally think of. And so one of the experiments we're doing now actually is to look at how different stocks of honeybees are responding when they're exposed to different health challenges, including a fungicide. So there are, to circle back, one of the things you asked in this question was about referring to different groups of pesticides, so such as herbicides and fungicides. These are groups of pesticides that have traditionally been thought of as bee-friendly. And they're thought of that way because they cause very low mortality, that's fair. If you're measuring in mortality, these groups do cause small amounts of mortality compared to any insecticide, you know, so that makes sense. But there are sublethal effects of many non-insecticide based pesticides. And there are other cascading effects, I would call it. So for instance, glyphosate use is Roundup. Glyphosate is Roundup.
I know that word very well.
Yeah, and it's an herbicide, and it's the heat maps of glyphosate use in the US are incredible. You can see that it gets into all the waterways in the US and it persists. And so here on the banks of the Mississippi, we really have very high levels of glyphosate. And so that sort of thing you may not think of as impacting the bees because maybe it was applied upriver, or maybe it was applied in someone's backyard. So how could it be down a side channel that's right next to your apiary? But for one thing, the bees are foraging on water, which we mentioned earlier in passing. And for another thing, it's got these sort of cascading effects. People are applying this to kill plants. A lot of those plants are plants that the bees
Exactly.
are utilizing for nutrition. And because y'all are in a drought, you know the importance of nutrition because you're not getting nutrition right now. So
that really should be thought through. That should be thought through.
It's really a multifaceted thing, right? And
what are some of those sublethal effects? Is it the lack of ability? This is just some things I've read in passing over the year. The lack of the ability to find forage or find their way back from forage. There's these little caveats that tend to happen to their nervous system and so forth. Is that what you're referring to when you say sublethal?
Yeah, those sorts of effects. So for instance, in my dissertation work, we were seeing sublethal effects could mean smaller queens, and traditionally bigger queens are better. Lower egg laying rates, less attractive pheromone mixtures, different mating frequency. So the number of drones that some queens mated with were different than queens reared in different pesticide exposed environments. These are all sublethal effects. They're things that are not always readily apparent the way mortality is. And in worker bees, especially out of Jerry Wright's lab and some of her work with pesticides, she's a researcher out of the UK. And her lab has shown that the worker bee brain gets a bit confused sometimes when it encounters pesticides. And so food choices get confuzzled, for a lack of a better term. Bees that are
they get lost. They just, it disorients them, right?
Yeah, so bees that are not exposed to pesticides will make some food choices, but after pesticide exposure, will make different choices. And that's unfortunate because as a lot of Pierre Lau's work shows, and he's out of the Stoneville USDA lab now, a lot of his work is shown or further emphasized and shown that honeybees really adhere to a tight, what's known as a geometric framework, where they have very precise nutritional needs. They know exactly what those are, and they will make the right nutritional choices to meet those needs. So when their decision-making capabilities are compromised, it really can affect the nutritional health of the entire colony. And I do have a soapbox caveat to add to this, Chari.
Love to hear
it. When we think of pesticides, a lot of times we're thinking of the things that our neighbors are doing. So it's like, that neighbor spraying their dandelions, how dare they? And that's fair, but also don't forget that old adage about throwing stones when you're in a glass house. So as an industry, we've historically been really irresponsible about our own pesticide use. I would never advocate for completely never using pesticides, because I haven't found a way in my research or in my personal beekeeping to successfully manage varroa in a completely pesticide-free way in the yards that I've ever had access to.
Yeah.
But I do absolutely advocate for responsible use of pesticides. And so what I mean by that is We know from surveys of beeswax in the United States and in North America, particularly one by Mullen et al., that Chris Mullen showed that the levels of pesticides in our beeswax were incredible, even in operations that had never used pesticides themselves. And Kirsten Trainer has had work that echoes these findings, so have any number of other people. So these pesticides are in our wax because collectively we as a community have used and overused pesticides. That beeswax gets recycled and turned into new foundation, which we buy. And so as a community, we really have to look out for each other and make sure that we're applying pesticides according to the label, according to the instructions. As a side note, it's illegal to do otherwise.
Exactly, and only when it's warranted. I think that's so important. I'm read quite a bit of Kristen Trainer's research and just love her writing and love what she's shown us. But it is so important to know, and we've sat in on many seminars about how that wax is it's a porous. I mean, it truly is going to be like a sponge to anything your bees are walking in that hive with. And that sublethal effect can just be the home they're living in.
Yeah.
Truly. Switching out comb, rotating frames out, and probably more so than we ever really think is necessary. We tend to wait till the ears break off, don't we? We tend to, because we've even got ear menders that we can get that longevity out of that frame. But we probably ought to be thinking more about what is on that comb. And just what you said, that the effects of the comb and the pesticides is a big deal. That is all so good, and you're very proficient in that, in your research, and your ability to retain that information and their authors is much better than myself. I know I've read a lot of that information, but then to be able to attribute it to the author is wonderful. I had to look it up, but that's great. So I want to kind of close this out on a positive note, if we can. And where are you seeing us? Are we making progress? Are we, what's the feel good about this, about us being hobby beekeepers and the contribution that we are to this vast industry? Are you seeing positive impacts from this and the research being done and so forth?
I think that it's a really exciting time to be a researcher for honeybees right now. And I say that in a good way, not a ghoulish way. We're constantly learning more, and we're constantly discovering new things. And a lot of part of the reason that we're able to do that is because we are supported in a way that we have never been so supported until now. And that's because of ambassadors who care about honeybees and who a lot of times are hobbyist beekeepers themselves. So for instance, there were bee colonies at the White House for quite some time. That's so neat.
High profile.
Yeah. And
That's
it really, that sort of interest at all sorts of levels in society means that there's a lot of social and economic support for research. And when there's that support and those resources, the sky's the limit, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And I really think that hobby, and we do kind of preach this, that hobby beekeepers in a roundabout way, because we tend to not do that great a job. We populated the feral colonies since it was so down years ago. Not that that's a good thing, but we are helping. And in repopulating, even if it's just our little micro, what you call it, a microclimate. I love that. We're repopulating our microclimates for our neighborhoods and such. I could talk to you all day. You, how intelligent you've grown. I'm so proud of you. And I know I've said that more than once today, but you, I would love to revisit with you next year when you've gotten further along with what's going on in Louisiana. We plan on taking this beyond our borders and going Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and so forth. So I'd love your input as things progress for you. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you
so much for joining me. And we'll be back in touch as far as where things are going with the USDA in Louisiana and Liz Walsh.
Thanks
Thanks
you so
again.
much.
We'll visit soon.